I invested everything I had, every penny I had saved, into making the wedding celebration my son so desperately desired a reality. However, in front of everyone present at the reception, he spoke words of filial gratitude to another person, calling her his true mother figure. It was at that precise moment that I realized a painful truth. For him, I simply didn't exist. That revelation irreversibly transformed something fundamental within me. Before sharing the details of what I experienced, I'd like to ask you something. Where in the world are you listening to this story from? I'd really like to know where you're standing with me right now. The venue looked splendid that night. I must admit, the elegant chandeliers cast delicate sparkles over the perfectly arranged decor. Every detail seemed straight out of an expensive fantasy. Gleaming crystal, floral arrangements in soft hues, musicians playing gentle melodies that were barely audible amid the murmur and joy of the audience. It was my son, Alejandro's wedding. He looked truly handsome. He'd always had a vain streak, and in that specially tailored suit, he was reminiscent of those heartthrobs from classic movies. Next to him, Roberta beamed with happiness. The two seemed genuinely destined to be together. I, Celeste, now 69 years old, sat at a table quite far from the main dining area. I was neither too close nor too distant, just in that position where it's easy to be overlooked without arousing suspicion. The name card on my plate contained a small error that probably no one would notice, except me. Naturally, I noticed. The bride's mother, Raquel, was summoned to address the guests. She did so with genuine tears and phrases that, although seemingly pre-prepared, were effective. She spoke about love, nurturing, and maternal pride. Those present applauded enthusiastically. I maintained a discreet smile. I hadn't come to establish competitions. After a while, I heard the distinctive sound of a fork gently tapping a glass. The music stopped, and silence filled the air. Alejandro stood up, sporting that expression I recognized from his childhood. "I wish to express my very special thanks," he announced. My pulse quickened. For a brief moment, barely a second, I imagined he'd turn his gaze toward me, mentioning the sleepless nights, the fevers I endured holding him in my arms, the impromptu birthday celebrations with the limited resources we had. But no, he turned his face completely away. I want to express my gratitude to the person who supported me throughout this entire process, who welcomed me with such affection and dedication. My true mother, Raquel. A lump instantly formed in my throat. I watched as people turned their heads, first toward her, then toward me, with that slightly uncomfortable expression. Raquel placed her hand on her chest, visibly moved, as if she was starring in a movie scene. My son, that same boy who used to fall asleep lying on my lap, now offered his filial love to another woman. I shed no tears, showed no reaction, simply inhaled deeply, and kept my face serene. There are pains that don't require a show. They burn silently. Someone murmured near me, "What a touching tribute." I didn't respond. I remained motionless, contemplating the candle flame flickering in front of me, a tiny, steady, yet fragile flame. And I reflected, this is how a mother gradually fades away, without anyone really noticing, as the guests gathered in the central area of the ballroom. Marveling at the first wedding dance, I sat completely still. The applause, the expressions of joy, the flashing cameras, everything seemed distant, as if I were looking through thick glass. I watched Alejandro gracefully spin Roberta around. His eyes shone brightly. At that very moment, a bitter feeling washed over me. This wasn't simply an oversight. It was a clear portrait of who he had become. And the hardest thing to accept was acknowledging that I had allowed this to happen. My heart went back in time to a grey March afternoon, so many years ago. It was 1978. The kind of day that begins strangely, you know. The rain was falling steadily, and I was still working, my feet aching and my uniform soaked when the phone rang. On the other end of the line, a trembling voice told me something that will forever remain etched in my memory. My sister and her husband had been in a terrible accident and had not survived. I remember dropping everything and running. I didn't even think about it. When I arrived at the hospital, completely soaked, my gaze went straight to that little boy, sitting on the edge of the stretcher. It was Alejandro, 5 years old, so tiny and vulnerable. His hands were dirty, his cheeks marked by tears and soot. He shrank away as if he wanted to disappear. He repeated in a low voice, "Mom, Mom," as if casting a spell to bring her back. They came to ask me if I could take him. "Temporarily," they said. But I didn't wait for them to finish the sentence. I knew deep down it wouldn't be for a short time. I was very young then, barely 22 years old, and I worked in a hospital as a nurse. I worked long hours and received little pay, barely managing to survive on my own. But that night, when he fell asleep on my lap, his face still warm from crying, I understood. From that moment on, I felt an overwhelming need to care for him, to give everything for his well-being. Caring for Alejandro was like walking in the dark, holding a dim flashlight. I stumbled frequently, made mistakes, but never stopped moving forward. I lacked experience and resources. I was too young, too alone, and yet every decision I made came from my heart. There were nights when we both cried. He missed his mother. I feared I wasn't good enough. I learned motherhood by trying, making mistakes, trying again. And I was that every single day without fail. So when I saw him there, all grown up, confident, surrounded by people and smiles, and when I heard him dedicate his deepest gratitude to another woman, as if I had never existed, it tore me apart inside. It wasn't just what he said. It was what he left out. It was the silence, the absence. It was as if the years of struggle, of sacrifice, of silent love had been erased with a single declaration. He offered his gratitude to someone who came later and left me empty-handed. At that moment, I realized something that was difficult to learn when someone gives themselves completely, without reserving a little space for themselves. They risk disappearing from their own narrative. And there, sitting in silence, with a hidden smile on my face and a tightness in my chest, I realized that perhaps I loved so much that I became invisible. Working double shifts became my daily routine. I spent my days at the hospital, and on weekends, I headed straight to the nursing home across town. Proper sleep became a distant memory, and romantic love was locked away in a box I never opened again. No man wanted to get involved with an exhausted woman, smelling of hospital disinfectant, holding a sad child by the hand. Eventually I stopped trying. My hair turned grey before I was 40. I never had money left over for a beauty salon, or for trips, or even for a full day off. But I still tried. My God, how I tried. When I couldn't afford gifts, I invented things. I used cardboard to build castles. Shoeboxes became miniature worlds. I once spent nights sewing a superhero costume using scraps of an old gown and blue thread. All for him. I couldn't give him everything materially, but I wanted him to have good memories. He'd always called me Aunt Celeste since I was little, but we never directly addressed the topic. I told myself I was too young to understand, and then, well, time went by and I kept putting it off. Deep down, I didn't know if he really understood what that meant. Would he think I was just an aunt who raised him of her own free will? Or would he believe his mother would one day return? The day he turned 18, I decided to tell him everything. I sat with him in the kitchen after coffee and explained that he wasn't my biological son, that I took him in after the accident, that I legally adopted him. He didn't even look up from the bowl, just said too casually, "I knew it. You're not exactly my mother." I felt the ground sink beneath my feet, but I took a deep breath. "I just thought you deserved to know the whole thing," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. Even though my heart was crumbling inside, he shrugged. "Thanks, I guess." Then he stood up and placed the bowl in the sink, as if it were just an ordinary conversation. I sat there trying to convince my heart that it was just her age, her stage, her way of being. But that phrase remained stuck inside me, like a cold weight on my chest. "You're not exactly my mother. I was there for every fever, every nightmare, every forgotten homework assignment. I sewed, I cooked, I sang softly to sleep. I gave everything I could, but in the end, it meant nothing. Even with everything, I stayed. I stayed out of love for him. I continued doing what I always did, caring, giving of myself, waiting. I watched Alejandro grow before my eyes. That fragile child who fit in my arms looked down on me, taller than me, with a firm voice and a sure gait. But even when he began to change, to distance himself, I never stopped being a mother. And then Roberta appeared. Roberta entered my son's life, like someone who already knows her way around perfectly. She was different from anything he'd brought home before. Always well-groomed, her speech calm, elegant, even overly so for casual encounters. Her smile was attractive, but her cold, calculating eyes never truly rested on me. The first time I saw her, I made sure to make the chicken pie Alejandro had loved since he was a child. It was the dish I used to make for his birthdays, when money was tight, but love was plentiful. I spent the whole afternoon cooking. She looked at her plate briefly and said with a rather too polite air, "Oh, I don't eat gluten." She spent dinner talking about business, investments, and luxury properties. Alejandro listened like a student attentive to his teacher's words. He didn't even seem to notice that the dish was as always, with the taste of home. As we said goodbye, she gave me a quick hug, one of those that barely touched my skin. "Thank you, Celeste." Just that. Like someone thanking the cashier for bagging their groceries. Still, I tried not to judge. I told myself that maybe he just needed time. But that time never came. As the months passed, Alejandro became more distant. The calls that used to come on Sundays became fewer. First bi-weekly, then monthly, then only when he needed something. A document, some information, a signature. He never asked how I was again. I began to hear more about Raquel, his mother-in-law, than about my own son. She organized the lunches, helped with the trips, and participated in the selection of the furniture. She was the one who stood by his side. I was never invited even for a simple afternoon tea. He didn't announce the engagement. I found out about it through a social media post. Roberta herself tagged me after everyone else had already commented. I responded with a heart emoji. No one said anything. No thanks, no gestures. A week later, I ran into an old neighbor at the market. She smiled. "Congratulations on Alejandro's wedding. The bridal shower was beautiful. You must have enjoyed it a lot, right?" I just laughed and said I couldn't attend. The truth is, no one told me there was one. It wasn't direct. It was subtle. Like someone erasing a person from a photograph. An invitation that never arrives. A meeting that isn't discussed. A choice of words that leaves me out. And Alejandro didn't just allow it. He adapted, accepting my absence as if it were natural. And that, more than anything, was what hurt the most. I was organizing some old boxes in the closet when I found a folder filled with papers, yellowed by age. Among them, a nearly faded crayon drawing caught my eye. It was simple, childlike, but touching. Alejandro and I held hands, with a huge smiling sun above us. Below, in crooked letters, he wrote, "Me and Mom." That paralyzed me. I instantly remembered when she finally started calling me that after years of saying, "Aunt Celeste," with some distance, I cried that day in silence. hidden in the bathroom, not for the name, but for the recognition, for the feeling of belonging. It took so many years of trying to be enough, striving to occupy a space that wasn't originally mine, but which I embraced with all the love in the world. And there I was, so many years later, with that piece of paper in my hands, feeling like an extra in his life. A short time later, he showed up at my door unannounced. It was an ordinary Wednesday. I was folding towels fresh from the dryer, distracted by the constant whirring of the machine. When I heard the doorbell, my heart skipped a beat. I still find myself longing for those unexpected visits, as if it means he still thinks about me occasionally. I opened the door and there he was. A vacant smile, a hurried gaze. He entered without saying much, as if he were in a house he hadn't visited in years. He looked around, scanning the furniture he'd helped assemble himself as a teenager, but didn't comment. He got straight to the point. Roberta and I are looking for wedding venues. I remained silent, just watching as he spoke. He said they'd found a beautiful space, overlooking the city, one of those with a modern terrace and open spaces, ideal for photography, for recording, for impressing guests. Roberta's mother has already contributed a portion, he continued, sounding as if he wanted to avoid any awkwardness. But there's still a considerable amount missing. He took a deep breath, as if trying to soften the blow. That would be $20,000. For a moment, I thought I'd misunderstood. Dollars? I asked, trying to hide my surprise. He nodded naturally, as if it were something simple. It's your son's wedding, he said, with an impatience that was almost imperceptible, but present. You always said you wanted it to be a special day. I stared at him, trying to understand if he still saw who I was. Because at that moment, it wasn't just the money he was asking for. It was everything I could offer. It was as if he was reaching out, not for help, but out of obligation, like someone picking up something they believe already belongs to them. Maybe I never stopped being invisible. I just didn't want to see it. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same one where years ago I had cut the crusts off his bread and helped him with his homework. But now the atmosphere was different. I held my teacup with both hands, trying to hide my discomfort. That money, I began, my voice cracking slightly, is what I set aside for emergencies. A hospitalization, an unexpected event, or who knows, so I wouldn't be a burden on anyone at the end of my life. He looked at me without blinking, then leaned back, crossing his arms as if we were discussing some detail. If you really love me, you won't let money come between us, he said, and it was there that my heart sank. Because he was my son, the boy I carried in my arms when he was sick, the one I watched through the cracks in the window, waiting for him to return from the holidays, the one for whom I had prayed so many times in silence. But now he was a stranger with a familiar face. I sighed and tried to smile, though nothing in me seemed funny. Give me a day, I said softly. I'll figure it out. He stood up quickly and picked up his cell phone from the table. Thanks, Mom. Roberta will be relieved. We already closed the contract on the place. He didn't ask how he would get it, or if he would be left with nothing. He just left. He left the door open as if he would return soon, but he didn't. The next morning, I walked to the bank. I tried to ignore the pain in my stomach. I made the full withdrawal of my savings. The teller looked at me as if she wanted to ask a question, but remained silent. I calmly signed the papers, although inside, I was shaking like a leaf in the wind. I got home, wrote the check, and carefully placed it in the envelope, as if that would make everything easier. I left it on the porch, hoping Alejandro would show up, but it was Roberta who came. She took the envelope without ringing the bell, without looking inside, without saying a word. The days passed. No calls, no messages, no thanks. It was as if that gesture had been an obligation of mine, as if my silence was expected, as if my love were an eternal debt and not a choice. And there, sitting again at that same table, alone, I understood that there are moments in life when the greatest pain comes not from a lack of gratitude, but from realizing that you have ceased to exist in the priorities of the one you loved most. When preparations for Alejandro's wedding began, I quickly realized that my role would be discreet. Decisions were made without me. I only found out later, when everything had been decided. I once received an email from Roberta, brief and to the point. She asked me to choose an outfit in neutral tones so as not to clash. I simply responded affirmatively. There was no response. Still, I made an effort. I wanted to be present, even if silent. I arrived early on the day of the ceremony. I chose a coral dress. It wasn't flashy, but it wasn't overpowering either. It was a color I'd always thought was pretty, but I'd never had the courage to wear. The store clerk said it brightened my face, and for some reason, that day I decided to believe her. I lovingly had it fitted. I paid extra for a quality weave. I curled my hair lightly and sprayed on that vintage perfume I only wear on special occasions. I even took out of the box the pearl earrings Alejandro gave me when he graduated. I kept those earrings for years as a symbol of pride and affection. No one came to greet me in the hall. The young man from the organization office just confirmed my name and pointed. Table 17. I walked over. It was near the kitchen door, almost behind the scenes. I sat down slowly, trying to ignore the discomfort in my chest. Outside, I saw them already taking pictures in the garden. Roberta, beautiful, in the center. Alejandro, smiling, beside her. Raquel, Roberta's mother, posed with her hand on his shoulder. That image remained etched in my mind. No one invited me to participate, not even a hello. I stood there waiting as if there was still a chance someone would notice me. But no invitation for a photo, not even a gesture. I smoothed down the fabric of my dress and tried to remember how to smile, as if that hadn't already crossed my mind. Over time, I learned to shrink certain pains, to push everything that throbs, everything that might make me cry in public, into a corner of my soul. That's how I managed to get through situations that hurt more than I was willing to admit. The wedding was beautiful. No one can deny it. Everything was impeccable. The orchestral sound, the light, almost magical decor, the well-written vows, rehearsed like something out of a movie. Alejandro was elegant, imposing, and distant. He was no longer the little boy who ran around the house barefoot and called me in the middle of the night just to see if I was still there. He was now a grown man, surrounded by people who seemed to have taken my place. At the reception, I sat quietly in my corner. Everyone was laughing, toasting, and taking turns taking photos. Raquel looked like a queen, smiling and confident, moving from table to table as if she were entertaining lifelong friends. Roberta also radiated that glow of a bride in love. And Alejandro smiled for everyone except me. It was as if I had become invisible. At one point, the speeches were announced. Raquel spoke first. She spoke emotionally about her daughter, about how their union was a dream come true. And then, with tears in her eyes, thanked Alejandro for having wholeheartedly entered her family. The entire room applauded. Alejandro immediately took the microphone. His face had a special glow. He took a deep breath and said he wanted to pay tribute to someone very special, someone who had been his pillar throughout this entire period. For a moment, my heart raced. I want to thank the woman who was like a mother to me, who supported me, who guided me with such love. Raquel, you are my true mother. Thank you for everything. I love you. The room erupted in applause, everyone smiling and excited. Standing there at the table, I listened to those words like someone who's been hit. and pretends they didn't feel it. Some people looked at me reflexively, then looked away. Maybe they didn't know what to do. Maybe they knew too much. I remained motionless. I just clasped my hands in my lap, with all the care in the world. The fabric of the dress felt like it was burning. I smiled. Yes, because smiling is all we have left when we don't want to cry in front of others. But inside, something crumbled in a way I knew would never fully rebuild itself. And that's what comes to mind most when I remember that day. Not the music, not the flowers, not the smiles in the photographs, but that moment when I smiled on the outside and silently broke inside. And as I looked at the people I had paid to celebrate, I knew something had to change. I arrived home late, my body tired, and my heart even more so. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't take off my shoes. I just went to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the folds of the coral dress scattered over my legs. He seemed exhausted too, not just from the wear and tear, but from everything that night symbolized. It was as if the fabric carried the unspoken words, the averted glances, the absence that screamed louder than any music at the party. The house was immersed in a heavy silence, one of those that seems to converse with oneself without saying anything. I looked around and realized how everything there bore witness to an entire life. The dusty picture frames, the albums no one looked at anymore, the paintings I'd hung myself. My eyes fell on the hall closet. Inside, among forgotten blankets and old shoeboxes, was a box I hadn't opened in years. I knew exactly where the key was, tucked deep in the dresser drawer, inside a yellowed envelope where I'd written, sometime in the distant past, use only when nothing else remains. That night seemed to be that moment. I sat at the table with the box open in front of me, like someone rummaging through a trunk of secrets that time has tried to erase. Inside, I found everything I had quietly collected over the years. Old contracts, investment documents, notebooks with notes, receipts stored with almost ceremonial care. Among them, a yellowed piece of paper with the deed to the land my father bought when I was still a child. Today, that piece of land was worth a fortune. My father always said, "Don't talk too much, just be prepared." He never relied on grand displays, but he taught me to guard, to plan ahead, to protect myself in silence. And that's exactly what I did my whole life. While everyone thought I was fragile, I grew up strong inside, without boasting. The next morning, I took a deep breath, calmly dressed, and headed straight to the office of Mr. Gonzalez, the lawyer who handled my father's inventory. I walked in with a folder full of papers and a purpose that had never seemed so clear. He greeted me in his usual calm manner, and I went straight ahead. "I want to make changes to my will." He looked at me over his glasses and asked, "Do you want to include anyone?" "No, I wish to delete." And so, without anger, without tears, only with the certainty of someone who finally understood his own worth, I removed everything from Alejandro, every penny, every good, every future benefit. Instead, I decided to create a small foundation, not something grand or with my name on it, just something meaningful. A fund dedicated to women like me, mothers who walked alone, maintained homes, raised children with dignity, but without applause. Mr. Gonzalez didn't question me. He just nodded, like someone who understood more than he needed to hear. When I left there, the sun met me at the door, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something different. It wasn't pride.